Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saroof. And joining me in just a minute is Brad Littlejohn, who is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, as well as being the founder and former director of the Davenant Institute. And he's also the author of this new article out at American Compass about digital technology, social media, the online world, and what is that is doing to our social and political life. We touch on a lot of themes like tradition, autonomy, freedom, and restraint. And so we hope you enjoy the episode.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Brad, thanks for joining me, and congratulations on the publication of this new article at the American Compass. I think, therefore I am, but it's the clever sort of like iPhone. It's I think. I don't know who came up with that. I chuckled. But it's about technology, the digital age, what it's doing to the non-digital aspects of society, and the various problems and maybe promises for conservatives and Christians in regard to the topic. But if you could just start us off, what's the broad and general form of the argument?
Yeah, well, I can't take credit for the title. That was Oren's stroke of genius. My original title was just Social Conservatism After Apple: Why Tech Policy is the New Family Policy. And the basic thesis is to say social conservatism is obviously getting hammered. The Democrats are further away from anything recognizably conservative than they've ever been, and now the Trump GOP is not really recognizably socially conservative in any meaningful sense since the new platform this summer. And particularly on pro-life issues, conservatives have been getting hammered. And so I started to start with the question, like, why is that? Is that just we were stabbed in the back by party operatives? Is it something we can kind of point to Trump specifically? And there's a lot of factors you could look at. But essentially, the reason the GOP is no longer consistently pro-life or socially conservative is because it wants to win a national election. And the national electorate is no longer consistently pro-life or pro-traditional marriage or anti-IVF or, pretty much the only thing that you can get a majority of even Republican voters clearly on board with is opposition to the transgender movement. So the goalposts have moved quite a bit. Now, why is that? I argue that we conservatives have underemphasized the role of technology in this shift. Right? Conservatives were ideas people. We're eggheads that sit around reading books, and so we kind of think that everybody else sits around reading books. And so when we see people in the electorate having what we consider bad ideas, we assume that must be because they were reading the wrong books or they had, Marxist college professors or whatever. But what's interesting is actually the most dramatic leftward movement, if you look at the data, is in non-college educated voters. So kind of Trump's core constituency. So blaming it on the Marxist college professors doesn't really do it. And also, if you look at the data, there's an interesting inflection point in the late 2000s. Now, I don't think you could prove any of this from data alone because there's already always so many different factors going on, and data is going to be messy, and it's really hard to get clear polling indications on these kinds of things. But the data is at least suggestive, and the data corroborates what I think intuitively you might otherwise recognize, which is to say that a generation habituated by digital media, habituated by smartphones and social media, is not going to instinctively think in conservative terms anymore. That basically all of the social imaginary, the digital ecosystem, is intrinsically unconservative. And we can go, I go through my essay a bunch of different ways this is the case, but sort of most fundamentally, if we just say the idea that there is a fixed human nature with limits, and that there are moral norms that sort of on the basis of that human nature that say you might want to do such and such, but just because you want to do it, you shouldn't do it, right? That's kind of like bedrock social conservatism, right? That's the digital realm is constructed on the opposite assumption, right? That the limits built-in limits of human nature are there to be transcended technologically, that we can abstract from the concreteness of material presence, and we can be whatever we want to be, do whatever we want to do, get whatever we want at just the click of a button online. And that kind of instant gratification, that kind of if I want it, why not? That's just how, especially younger people who've grown up in this ecosystem, instinctively think. And so, is it really that surprising that they can't see any reason why a woman, say, should be forced to carry an unwanted baby to term, right? That's that's just not the way they've been conditioned to live their lives.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI. That makes sense as a sort of a general matter. And I want to tie deeply into the sort of the idea that the technology isn't neutral, that the technology enforces or sort of catechizes certain ideals or norms as the new norm or as the new mode of being. And you start at the beginning of the piece with Marshall McLuhan or McLuhan. I'm not entirely sure how that's pronounced. But what does it mean, if you could explain and unpack what the sort of mantra that's become maybe more prominent or more well-known is, that the medium is the message? What does that mean, and how does that sort of underlie or relate to the case you're laying out?
Yeah. So yeah, his famous dictum, "The medium is the message," and this shouldn't really be surprising for us if we think about even what we know of like verbal face-to-face communication. It's often pointed out that your body language and tone of voice conveys a lot more than the actual words, right? So even when I'm speaking to you, the way that I'm speaking to you, that like what you hear more than anything is my tone of voice, and the actual words I say are secondary. So all the more so with any kind of, if we move beyond the voice to any other medium of communication, the medium itself has the most formative effect on how on the message that someone receives, regardless of what the actual text of the message is, right? So, just for instance, if we think about something like Twitter, now X, and of course now we don't have the 140, or it was originally 140, then 280 character limit. Now there's no limit, but still, like the kind of 280 characters is kind of how we've been habituated to use the medium. And I think what's striking there is, no matter what you're saying in those 280 characters, the fact that you are being forced to chop up your thoughts into bite-sized snippets, and that other people are being habituated to access your thought through bite-sized snippets. You can have rabid progressives and rabid conservatives sending opposite messages in 280 characters, but both of them are essentially, as authors, and then us as readers, being formed in the same pattern of thought, which is one that is very bite-sized, disconnected, and therefore not conducive to any kind of nuanced or complex logical argument, right? The idea is just make some kind of provocative slogan. That's what gets engagement. And so our thinking takes the form of, we think more and more in provocative slogans, because that's the way the medium is habituated, right? So I think just something like that is a clear illustration of that principle. And I go on to just argue that the medium of just this kind of boundlessness, this disembodiment, the instant gratification, all of these other things about the digital medium are sort of subconsciously telling us more than whatever content that we're actually imbibing on them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can see sort of what you're saying, too, is we have a lot of students at ISI. Some of them are kind of very online, especially, I'm 23 years old, so I was sort of raised, like I was coming of adolescence in this sort of age. where the smartphone takes off. My first phone was an iPhone. And I think for people about my age, that's maybe the first generation where that was the case. Like you probably had a flip phone long before you had an iPhone. Even if you even had a mobile phone, but now we have young people growing up and they're coming up on Twitter, and I can kind of see what parts of Twitter that they're on just by hearing what basically tweets they're mashing together to form an idea. And so that I think I noticed that, and I'm like, that's a problem if you're interested in forming people who can think clearly. That means being able to think deeply and in a sort of a broad way about a range of issues and how things fit together, and mashing together 280 characters together and trying to form these sorts of strange syntheses that don't really work. It's just not conducive to that type of, the life of the mind properly conceived. But yeah, I want to go now towards these various elements and have you unpack them each a little bit more. And in the piece, you identify 6 sort of elements of maybe a conservative or Christian worldview, or sort of core commitments that underlie the conservative maybe policy positions or political priorities. But those are limits, tradition, patience, dependence, embeddedness, and embodiedness. And if we're taking McLuhan seriously, the medium is the message that the digital age has made a lot of these things either irrelevant or in amongst the national electorate or popular the popular world as being askance or really out of place. What does social media and digitization do for these various 6 elements? Maybe we'll just start with the limits and then kind of go through the list.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, so limits, I mean, the basic idea here is we are finite beings, and therefore to learn to be a good human being is to learn how to flourish within the limits that are appropriate to human existence. And conservatism has sort of always emphasized this, right? Like economic conservatism sort of says, look, like money, you can't. Money is not an infinite resource. You can't rack up debt endlessly. You do have to balance a budget. You have to think in terms of trade-offs in terms of your policies. Social conservatives also emphasize the limits of our bodies, right? You can't. The limits of the body are what stands behind the case for traditional marriage, the case against transgenderism, etc. And of course, the digital realm is all about the absence and transcendence of limits. And in fact, our very language for it kind of highlights this sort of ethereal, vaporous quality of it. The cloud, the idea of streaming. And what we don't, in the online world, we don't have to think in terms of these fundamental constraints. We can kind of try to, just even something like how we become accustomed to the language of multitasking, right? You can always keep dozens of tabs open, and in theory, you're kind of keeping your options open. You're not limited to any one thing. You can switch back and forth from one thing to another thing. This is how we're more productive, or we think we're more productive. Often, of course, the multitasking actually undermines our productiveness. But it also habituates us in a way of thinking about the world and about ourselves as human beings, that where we can just think of sort of keeping an infinite, gazillion different tabs open in our life and being able to toggle back and forth between one to the other, and there's no consequences to the choices we make, because we can always just pivot to something else.
Great. And then what about like tradition and patience and some of these other ones?
Yeah. So the idea of tradition here is that conservatism is based on a kind of epistemology that understands that since learning to flourish within limits is a lesson that takes many lifetimes, we need to defer to the wisdom of those who've gone before us. And so conservatives have strong moral convictions, but we think those moral convictions are based in reason. So we'll make like rational natural law arguments. But I think, Burke, for instance, is very clear. While Burke thinks it is possible to make a good rational natural law argument for a lot of his positions, he says most people don't operate on that basis. Most people can't think on that level. Most people, their moral norms have to be shaped by prejudice. They have been brought up to believe this is just bad, and that because your elders said so, and their parents and their grandparents and so on and so forth. So this intergenerational sense of moral norms is a key part of the conservative worldview. Well, how does that work when in an ecosystem where the wisdom that the previous generation cultivated no longer seems remotely applicable because the world has changed so much? I mean, we do have a fundamental problem here. Whereas, like Burke's idea is founded on the idea that what your great great grandfather knew is still more or less applicable. Is what our great grandfathers knew still applicable? Like our technology is changing so fast. Even like you are, half a generation younger than me, and you're much more plugged in to how the technology works than I am, right? So, uh, this idea that the past can have some kind of authority over us just doesn't really seem to make sense in a rapidly evolving digital ecosystem. Then I talk about this idea of patience. Um, Again, if the world is a place with limits, we're always bumping up against those limits. We're encountering friction as we are trying to navigate the world. And so we should expect to be slowed down. And in fact, it's good to be slowed down because in that slowing down is the opportunity for reflection and judgment. Our first impulses are usually not our best impulses. We all we all know the experience of hitting enter on what we think is just a killer tweet response, and then we walk away, and a few minutes later we're like, maybe that wasn't the best thing to blast out to the entire world. Go and delete it and hope nobody screenshotted it yet, right? So, um, cultivation of patience is again a key part of how conservatives approach the world. Of course, this is in conservative politics emphasizes incremental change. You know
Hmm.
that you can't just like try to solve every problem all at once. You have to go slowly. Digital experience habituates us not to go slowly and to act on every immediate impulse. And in fact, the more we can do that, the more we become impatient with just ordinary sources of waiting and friction, right? Just like the experience of standing in line, I think uh, we find far more unbearable. I mean, nobody probably has loved the experience of standing in line, but we find it far more unbearable than our parents did because we're not used to having to wait in line for something. We're just used to, click on Amazon, next day delivery, boom, on to the next thing.
Yeah, and then when it doesn't show up, you're like, where is it? Where is it? When is it going to get here? When is it going to get here? No, that makes sense. Also, I have a friend who told me, and I've always kind of found this funny and chuckled, but he says conservatism is a sort of like an unsexy worldview or way of life because it's always saying wait and no and stop.
Yeah.
I mean, the famous dictum that conservatism is standing athwart history, yelling stop, sort of speaks to that idea. I'm also curious though because there's the other sort of element where it's just like conservatism is just liberalism, like 10 years slower. It's like, well, we want the same things, but we would like them in 20 years. So we have time to adjust rather than saying, what
Yeah.
in your view, and I don't think that this is a view you hold. So what in your view is the relationship between that sort of a cultivation of patience and slow and gradualism at the same time, also standing firmly rooted and inflexible on certain things and just saying, not stop or slow down, but no.
Yeah, I think that's the key question to ask, and I do think it's important to note that both of those have a validity, right?
Mhm.
Those who sort of say, yeah, conservatives are just 20 years behind liberalism. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because not every some developments are perfectly legitimate developments, and yet nonetheless, human nature being what it is, it takes time to adjust to those developments. And a political system that says, hang on, we've got this new technology, for instance. Uh, I mean, I think that this is actually a great case study here. I don't think that the proper conservative posture toward the smartphone would be to say, no, let's abolish these things and go back to flip phones or go back, where do you, how far do you try and go back? But it is to say, uh, all right, we have this big, very potentially disruptive new technology. Uh, Maybe we should take time and think about how we integrate this into our lives. Do we, what kind of I often use the example of automobiles, which it's interesting. With automobiles, we took a while to do this. So sort of originally automobiles were kind of a Wild West safety wise. But then we were like, maybe we need to make sure that kids don't drive these things. Maybe we need to make sure that they have these safety features, et cetera, et cetera. Because we just had ridiculous amounts of automotive deaths. So I think if we had applied those lessons and said, okay, we've got these smartphones, they're very useful, but how do we use them in a way that makes them safe for society, and especially safe for kids that are less able to use them wisely? I think that's where a conservative impulse wouldn't have yelled stop, but it would have yelled slow down, right? And then there are those things in which the conservative says, no, this is not just a development within human nature. This is actually something antithetical to human nature.
Right.
So a conservative is not for a slower implementation of transgender surgery on minors, right? They're for no implementation of transgender surgery on minors. But it does take that discernment to figure out when is the conservative posture one of slow down and when is it one of stop right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you read Edmund Burke, you kind of get a sense for both of those things. Burke is not an enemy of change, as Russell Kirk is always wants to say. He's not change just by itself, but there's good changes, necessary changes that then have to be mediated in the proper way and according to the proper time for the needs of human society. So you're not blowing up your whole society every 10, 15 years, whether it's a technological or ideological or sort of intellectual development. And then there's the stuff that's just like, this is bad for human beings of any time and of any place, and we just can't have it. But anyways, I want to go back to we were still going through this list before we got on this good tangent. So I think we're on dependence next.
Yeah. I'll try to skip along here because, you can read the essay, we want to read the whole thing. But yeah, I talk about dependence, embeddedness, and embodiment. I can kind of maybe tackle these three together, right?
Yeah, go for it.
Because they are closely related, although so I talk about dependence is this kind of vertical dimension. We all come into human life not as these autonomous Lockean individuals, but like radically dependent on at least one other human being, our mother, and generally a whole bunch of different human beings to take care of us and help us grow into mature people. And then, of course, we end our lives also in radical dependence on caregivers. So this dependence is a fundamental feature of human life, and I also talk about embeddedness, the kind of horizontal relationships. So both in terms of vertical relationships of dependence and horizontal relationships of embeddedness, that conservatives have a sort of socially thick account of what it means to be a human being. And of course, this is where the digital experience, especially social media, has so profoundly changed things. On the one hand, we are connected to a much greater number of people potentially, but the fact that since we are, going back to the first thing, finite creatures, if you increase the quantity of connections, and you still have the same kind of basic psychic material to work with, then you're going to have to decrease the quality of connections because we're not capable of sustaining 1,000, 10,000, really emotionally rich social connections. And so we have lots and lots of connections, but we hold them all very loosely, and we can kind of disconnect from any of them whenever we want to, right? We can ghost somebody, we can block somebody, we can mute somebody, right? We have all these ways of opting in and opting out of relationality whenever it's convenient. That, of course, is not, is totally not how human life has generally been lived. Usually, if you wanted to opt out of, an annoying relationship, you might have had to uproot and move to a totally new town, which wasn't an easy thing to do. And obviously, to some, like, we'd be wrong to deny the benefit here, right? There are a lot of, modernity is kind of this steady move away from these dense webs of embeddedness toward more autonomy, and we often tell these stories about the kind of the heroic the heroic individual who's stuck in this sort of small-minded community that doesn't understand them and doesn't understand their genius and is oppressing them and persecuting them, and they broke free and they went and did something amazing and world-changing, right? And half of our movies, are some version of this. And again, there's some truth there. Any of us who have, um, all of us do have relationships that we're stuck with that are very frustrating, and it can be nice to be able to get online and find discussion partners that we find more fruitful. But we have to recognize the extent to which we are fundamentally changing our sense of our humanity when we do that. We think that I am totally in the driver's seat of all of my relationships. These relationships are here to serve me when I want them, and then when I don't want them, I can just unplug, right? And again, you just think about what that does to the intuitions of somebody when thinking about um, something like the case for traditional marriage or the case for the against abortion. It's like I, if in every other area of my life I can't be stuck with an unwanted person, I just press the block button. Why on earth should a woman stuck with an unwanted person inside of her be expected to stick with it, right? And so then I go on to embodiment as the quintessential manifestation of this condition of dependence and embeddedness, right? We are dependent and embedded in lots of ways, but above all by being stuck in these bodies of ours. And conservatism, especially, conservatism as we know it here and now, is conserving the Judeo-Christian tradition. And the Judeo-Christian tradition has always emphasized the importance of the body. The body is not, just some annoying thing that we try to transcend and get rid of. It is a sacred vessel of of God. And so it's sort of on this basis that um, Christian sexual morality and Christian support for life from conception and all Christian concern over issues of euthanasia all comes from this conviction that our body is an irreducibly uh, essential part of who we are, right? And contrast that again with digital experience, where, for instance, something we haven't talked about here, but I talk about a number of times in my essay, and it needs to be talked about more, is what is the impact of a culture of ubiquitous pornography on how people, especially young people, uh, think about the world and think about morality, right? So if you're accustomed to the most intimate of all bodily experiences being performed in a disembodied way, what does that tell you about your relationship to your body, right? The body is just a kind of dispensable instrument that it's a pleasure maximizing machine that if it's no longer useful for pleasure maximizing, you get rid of it. That I think is how um, the rising generations are being catechized in that way of thinking. And as long as that happens, there's no way we can expect to win the cultural argument on a lot of these social issues.
That all makes a lot of sense to me, especially when you brought up the euthanasia point. With an issue like abortion, I mean, it might make some sense to people. And I mean, I've seen data on this. Tell me what you think, or where, if I'm missing this, is that people understand that by late term abortion, like a critical majority of the country recognizes that there should be limits on that. Um, on because there is at least another person, which I see what you're saying with the, if we can just discard people that we don't like to talk to or have to deal with digitally, that sort of, I can sort of see the reinforcing aspect. But there is a difference between, walking away from someone or blocking them and murdering them in the womb. And I still think, based on the data I've seen, is that by the late term, when it's more obvious to the naked eye that thing in the womb is a child, that's ready and waiting to be born, that there's still a sense that is not kosher, that you can't do that. And maybe I have the data wrong here, but
Yeah,
with an issue like euthanasia, it's not very obvious, quote unquote, who is harmed besides the person. And then the idea is, if I'm in the driver's seat, if I'm the master and the captain of my own ship, I should be able to do whatever I want to myself, sort of like you're saying. It's
Right.
this permissive, radical egalitarianism and like extreme social voluntarism that is being catechized, if I'm understanding you right.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the vast majority of people in our society would still, uh, oppose late-term abortions. Although it's striking just um, how some states have been kind of successful in at least removing really any legal obstacles to that. But it seems to me that you're looking at a holdover of a taboo that's going to gradually lose its force. I mean, because again, if you look at history, look at societies around the world, abortion and infanticide has been pretty normal
Yeah.
until like Christian civilization is fairly unique um, in opposing that. And so, what does that tell us? I think it tells us that our sort of yes, we might recognize yes that this is a human being and so on, but if it feels like too high of a social price to pay to commit to the preservation of this life, then society will just say not worth it, right? So I do think that what we are seeing is a sort of rapid desensitization of people to that, and a sense that again, if you take kind of autonomous self determination as the sacred ideal, and you recognize that carrying a child to term, raising a child is a sort of an intolerable burden upon the autonomous self determination, then you can find yourself saying, yes, it's terrible, yes, it's a tragedy, but getting rid of this baby is a necessary price to pay for this woman living the life she wants to live, right? So I do think fast forward 20 years, if we don't change some things fundamentally, you're going to see increasing support even for late term abortions, afterbirth abortions, etc.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think you're right about that, especially with the idea, the transformation of the abortion issue being safe, legal, and rare to abortion, like slavery used to be considered in the antebellum, is it went from being necessary evil to positive good. And I
Yeah.
see that the logic of that is this sort of ideological transformation from, um, you know, I, you and me being in various sort of embedded and limited social conditions and political communities to I'm the radical master of my own fate, and how dare you tell me anything else? Now, one thing that is I am curious about is that the ideological or sort of the worldview that um, the digitization is promoting is not new, in the sense of like even back in the 1970s, like Carl Whitman, who was writing the early gay manifestos, was talking about how children needed to be separated from their parents. Alexandra Kollontai, an early um, Bolshevik, was talking about a socially raised family for the sake of the needs of the state. Like you can go all the way back, like Burke's defense of tradition is against the philosophes and the radical, like the Rousseauian radical individualists. But so my question for you then is, it is is it the ideology is gradually unfolding and technology is a means for pushing and foisting the ideological worldview that's kind of cannibalizing our world, or is it more that am I still kind of misinterpreting what you're saying? What McLuhan's point is that actually it's just the ideologues had their view, but actually it's just technology is the means by which it's been done, not
Yeah.
necessarily good.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to be said there, right? So that's the common question. As I said, conservatives, we tend to think in ideas terms. We say ideas have consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't these technologies just the unfolding of those consequences? Or someone might say they might be able to grant more of a role to technology, but they would say, well, look, a lot of these things you're talking about are the result of much earlier technologies, the automobile or whatever. So a couple things need to be said. On the first point, I would say we need to think about ideas as seeds, right? And so if you can have the right seed, but if you put it in the wrong soil, it's never going to germinate. Or you could have very fertile soil and nobody ever puts a certain kind of seed in there, nothing's going to happen, right? So you need both the seed and the soil. And I think this is what you see with you can look back at the 19th century, the 18th century, or even some people like go 14th century, Duns Scotus or whatever, right? You can trace these kind of seminal ideas, of course, semen from Latin for seed, these seminal ideas that seem to anticipate these kind of radically progressive visions of humanity that we're now seeing the fruits of, right? Fruits, again, we're sticking with a kind of vegetable metaphor here, right? So, um, what's going on there? I think you can point to these earlier centuries and say, look, these radical ideas were already there. But you can also say the sort of they were they were the ideas of a few weirdos, hanging out in these philosophical salons. They weren't how normal people thought about the world. So what changes? Well, what changes is if the soil changes, the societal soil, such that a certain idea now makes sense, and now it's sort of time has come and it can germinate. So I think that's where you can see the role of technology. You have technological developments in the 20th century, especially, that suddenly provide a different context within which earlier philosophical ideas of radical autonomy start to make sense to people, right? You can make claims about radical autonomy in the 18th century, and most people are like, well, no, we're obviously not radically autonomous. Look, we're still, we're dependent upon the seasons. We have very, we're dependent on the cycle of life and death, and we have very little control over who dies, over stopping diseases, and we're dependent in all these ways. Your idea of radical autonomy is just silly. You start to change the technological environment, and the radical autonomy seems to make more sense, right? So the seed germinates in the soil, and I think we've seen that with a number of technologies over the last 150 years. But digital technology represents a kind of a phase shift, I argue, particularly just in its transcendence of the physical world. All these other technologies are kind of about how to, move faster, get around more easily within the physical world, how to use physical processes like the steam engine or whatever to make things happen more productively. But they're all still happening within the limits of physical time and space. But you and I here, we're communicating. I don't know, you're a couple hundred miles away, and we're talking in real time, right? We have completely left behind the world of the steam engine. So there's something fundamentally that's changed there. The other thing I would say is you need to think in terms of a feedback loop where, like, technologies don't just happen, or sometimes they do, in the sense that like someone just sort of stumbles upon a discovery that they weren't expecting. A lot of technologies come out of that. But in terms of what society chooses to invest time and energy and money into developing, they develop technologies that they think would be good for the world, right? So there is a kind of ideological element of, wouldn't it be good if we were more autonomous, right? Wouldn't it be good if we could, um, you know, choose to talk to anybody in the world rather than being stuck with this sort of narrow-minded circle of people in my little town, right? We have a sense of what we want out of the world, and therefore we pursue technologies that give us that. So to that extent, the idea can precede the technology, but there's a feedback loop where um, living within a certain technology also shapes our idea of what's good and of what we
Hmm.
want. And so on the basis of that, so that the technology itself changes our ideas, which then encourages the development of new technologies that instantiate those ideas, which then in turn change our desires more, right? So there's this inextricable relationship between the lived material conditions of our experience and our ideas and theories about our experience.
Yeah, that's would bring me to a question of the online world. And the upshot of this piece, obviously, is that the online world and digitization has radically and profoundly transformed the world outside of the digital space. It's actually transformed the world of bolts and nuts and bolts and all of that. And so, sort of on this sort of like feedback loop model, that which then changes how we live. Why is it not the case, or what is the relationship between the way that operates in reverse? Is that or maybe that gets us to the sort of the end of the piece, which is your various policy proposals of like, here's how we can tame the beast.
Yes, right. So yeah, we don't want to have a kind of such a deterministic thing that like the technology so inexorably change affects how we think that there's nothing we can do about it, right? The whole point of writing a piece like this is saying is done in faith that by changing people's thoughts about the thing, we can then turn the thing in reverse and sort of change the technology, change how we use them. So yeah, so the piece actually does conclude on a positive note. Very, I mean, like it sounds very, very glum. You just hear this, like, okay, you're saying, the reason social conservatives are losing the electorate is because, you know, smartphones. Well, those aren't going away anytime soon, so we can just expect to lose the electorate. We're going to go. We're doomed to extinction, like the Federalist Party of the early 19th century. Potentially, but I think it's actually, it is in some ways, it's a message of hope because I think sometimes the way conservatives think is we do think in this such kind of a Hegelian idea of history in terms of like we think progressive ideas are bad and wrong, but we still sometimes think as if they kind of there's this necessary logical unfolding, like of course, like of well, yeah, of course, cultural Marxism is going to triumph, and it's sort of and like we can only like we just expect to lose forever and ever, right? And what I want to say is no, like the changes that we're seeing in the way that most people think about these things are not the result of some kind of inexorably unfolding historical logic of ideas, but are very contingent based on the technologies we've chosen to create and how we've chosen to use them, and we can choose differently. And again, that doesn't have to mean choosing to totally get rid of the technology, because I think human nature is quite resilient, and I think you even see this. A lot of young people recognize the extent to which their digital habits are malforming them, and they seek. Some of them are like dumb phones are becoming fashionable again, and they're looking for ways of face to face connection. They understand that they're missing something fundamental. So it's not like people are so caught within this they can't even see some reality outside of it. Um, so what I think that tells me is that, oh, I mean, actually, basically what I say in the piece is let's at least start. This might not be sufficient, but we could at least start with regulating these technologies, regulating these companies more or less the way we regulate other technologies and companies, which we just haven't done. Like if you just look at, I mean, like just on like product liability, like product liability applies to pretty much any product except digital product. Uh, and this is potentially being challenged as an interesting case going forward, Anderson versus TikTok, where TikTok's algorithm told a 10-year-old girl to try asphyxiating herself and she died, right? And uh, the Third Circuit Court finally said, maybe they could be held liable for that, right? Just like if you design any other product that's like you could, if you designed, a car manufacturer designed a seatbelt that predictably would function in a way that would cause a 10-year-old to suffocate, then that car manufacturer would be sued. We know that, right? And so they have to think about these things when they're designing things. Thus far, internet companies haven't had to think about that. They've been totally immune from this. So therefore, the products have developed in ways that are sort of uniquely deformative, right? They're designed to exploit our attention in pathological ways because they don't have any legal liability for it. So we don't have to do anything terribly radical, at least for starters. We just have to say, let's treat this industry the way we treat other industries. And if we do that, this industry will then be incentivized to make these products in a way that sort of affirms, like works with our humanity rather than working against our humanity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, before we get a little bit more into the granulars of this idea of tech policy tech policy as family policy, um, I'd be curious with the idea that like dumb phones are becoming popular again. What do you see as being the prospects for opting out of the sort of overarching social model of digital social media based highly integrated online life? I have a sense that, and tell me what you think, is that it's actually very hard. We kind of, the Luddites or the late adopters, I think that's what Martin Gurry calls them, are kind of going to get dragged kicking and screaming into this. Like just think about like two-factor authentication. Logging into my email, which is maybe what is one of the most basic and rudimentary digital technological uh, services I could use. Well, now I need a second factor, and I'm not expert on this, so maybe you could just do that on your computer itself without needing a
Well, no, I
smartphone.
mean, some of them are designed now. You need a smartphone. You can't.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
but Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, yeah. It's hilarious because my colleague Claire Morell and I were writing an article for National Affairs about just precisely this phenomenon of making smartphones necessary for participation in the economy. And while we were in the process of writing that, EPPC locked us out of our email because it required a smartphone app to get in. Anyway, I protested to our operations director. He's like, "I didn't do this. This is Microsoft Outlook." Um, so yeah, so this is a problem that even as people are becoming more aware of the harmful effects of these devices, and some people are saying, "Look, I'd rather opt out." And especially as we're saying, let's maybe help children opt out. Even as we're doing that, at the same time, the society and the economy seem to be moving rapidly to make these absolutely indispensable, right? It's like they're as necessary as uh, credit cards or electricity or whatever. So, what do we do about that? Again, you can look at that and those examples. Example of electricity, say, and say, well, look, what are you going to do? This is how technology develops. First, it starts off as a luxury, then it becomes a broad market consumer option, and then it becomes a necessity. And that's just how it goes. But it doesn't always. It doesn't have to. And I think the interesting case to look at is the automobile, where particularly, I mean, this depends where you live, but we've tried to say in places where it's feasible, in higher density areas, let's make it possible for people to get around without an automobile. Let's make
Yeah.
sure to have pedestrian only shopping areas. Let's make sure to have crosswalks. Let's make sure to have bike lanes. Let's incentivize this in various ways. And we're not going to, if you want to have a car, great, but we at least want to make it where you can function without a car. So I think we need to do something similar with policy in this area. And again, like it's all a question of what policy levers you choose to pull. Like we went through a period where it was this idea, it was like human right to have broadband internet access, and therefore governments poured a lot of money into helping rural areas get as online as possible with the idea that people were being, basically in the name of equality and non-discrimination, we need everyone to be as plugged in as possible. Well, I think now we need to say, no, no, no. In the name of equality and non-discrimination, those who choose to be more unplugged
Yeah.
should be able to be more unplugged. I mean, one of the things Claire and I proposed in our article is just using something as simple as like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which says you have to make your product or service accessible to somebody with these disabilities, right? Therefore, you ought to make your product or service accessible to somebody who says, "I don't want to have a smartphone because it's maybe you can treat that if you want to treat that as pathological. It's pathological not to want to have a smartphone. Still, we can say that if somebody is has this pathology, we still make accommodations for them. So
Yeah, and then so I guess just in closing, what are some of the things, because I think this part of the conversation lends itself to saying that we have various personal desires perhaps to stay unplugged, or if not completely unplugged, it's sort of a little bit impossible, to keep the most advancing propensities towards getting stuck in the cloud. We want to keep that at arm's length, but that itself may not be enough without a larger sort of social or policy oriented focus. So tech policy is family policy. If you could just lay out in closing the vision or some things that should be whether or not specific bill or legislative priorities, like a political priority for how we should be thinking about um, you know, salvaging or renewing a social conservatism after Apple, to go back to your kind of your
Yeah,
original
yeah, yeah,
title.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think family policy has to begin with helping, enabling families to function as families. That is to say, with sort of boundaries that are not completely porous to the rest of the society. A family is a place in which you have parents and children. The parents have a level of authority over the children. There was a recently this article, or was it, I think the Surgeon General wrote this op-ed about how parents are, we need to recognize the sort of mental health crisis of parenting, and it's not shouldn't be surprising to us that parents are having a mental health crisis, because we've created a society in which parents are consistently disempowered from functioning as parents. Just think about if we had a think about the proposition that as a parent you need to let an endless parade of strangers come through your house and talk to your children and try to sell products to them, and encourage them to try asphyxiating themselves, right? um, and that's what we've effectively done with these technologies. And you can say, well, parents have made, every parent decided to buy that phone for their kids. They could put parental controls on them. It's the parents are in charge. But the reality is that the given that it's a collective action problem, and individual parents can't solve this without the help of communities that make it. They're fighting a very uphill battle against these tech companies, such that, like, you can get a device and put good parental controls on it, but it's exhausting and difficult. We could have, just like we have with automobiles, we could require these devices to be shipped with built-in protections that make it super easy for parents to help their kids use them responsibly, right? Or we could have public, what we're seeing right now, and this is what's really encouraging. I think we see this huge bipartisan move to get phones out of schools.
Mm-hmm.
And what that's doing is it's saying, look, this is going to be a phone-free space. If you want to get your kid a phone at home, then fine, but they don't have to have one, and they're not going to be able to use it most of the day anyway. And so you create a new incentive structure whereby parents are actually able to reestablish boundaries that have been dissolved. So I think let's pursue a family policy that recognizes that families have to have boundaries, and those boundaries right now are extremely porous in the face of what we've allowed big tech to do. And if we and there's a huge bipartisan will to fight back against this, it seems to me. And again, you can make this case on kind of progressive terms. If you look about it, look at the data, there's a digital divide between classes and between whites and minorities, where highly educated, upper income whites kids are not on their screens nearly as much, right? But you look at lower income blacks and Hispanics, it's like double that, right? Which again reflects that it is a lot of work and energy to fight back against this. And if you got two working parents that they don't have, they just give their kid an iPad, right? So anyway, it's a social justice issue. In other words, conservatives should say to progressives, this is a social justice issue. The way that these technologies are functioning, and we need to re-empower parents to actually raise their children. And if we do that, then we will create, I think, that means that those children will have a better chance of coming into adulthood with a desire to raise their own children. I think what we're seeing now, I say in the piece, young people aren't voting pro-life because they don't feel pro-life. We see that they're not pro their own lives. We see a very high rise of suicide among teens. So create a generation of kids that are actually able to enjoy life again, enthusiastic about their own lives, and have a good relationship with their own parents. And you might see a revival in birth rates, revival in commitment to pro-life cause, things of that sort.
Yeah, and I mean, I have younger cousins, so I kind of watched that fight. Of not only the why is Johnny the only kid who doesn't have a phone in school? So there's the sort of the social peer pressure where other parents are giving their children. So there's this pressure that well, he's 13. Isn't it time? But then also the fight over how much time and what you can do and what you can't do. So yeah, those policy positions all make sense. And actually, I do have one last question if you've got the time, which is,
Sure.
our political tradition is one in which it's not licentiousness. You can just do whatever you want, anything goes. But it is liberty, and we recognize that there will be some sort of individuals will make errors in the use of that liberty. There's some kind of medium where we're going to allow some of that for the sake of a broad, probably understood conception of liberty, which is I get to govern my own affairs in such a way that's not only not harmful to others, but it's supposed to build up the common good. And there are certain rules and limitations in place politically and socially that applies to all adults. There's a much what we were talking about with children, where there's a history and tradition of understanding that parents are in charge. Children aren't granted the same rights because they're much more liable to misuse them than, say, a well-formed adult. So my last question would be, what would be a tech policy for adults that would be at the political level that's sort of in line with
Yeah.
the traditions of American liberty, but still recognizes the problems that might need to be curbed across the board?
I mean, I think it's as simple as, again, like, look at how we treat other products and industries, and we recognize this category of addictive substances, right? And we regulate addictive substances differently than we regulate other substances. And we do it, there's not a clear answer, and it's often politically contested because there's different levels of addictiveness and different levels of harm. And tobacco, for instance, is one where we've said can't sell to kids, can't market to kids. You've got to have these kind of disclaimers. There may be high excise taxes on them. We do various things to discourage it, but ultimately say, look, if an adult wants to be addicted to cigarettes, and they can choose to do that.
Right.
But we at least sort of put in some things, some speed bumps, and those speed bumps have had a dramatic impact. If you look at rates of smoking, dramatically downward. And then some areas we don't just put speed bumps, like with more powerfully addictive drugs, we say not at all. We recognize, or we say they have to be administered by a physician, right? So the opioid epidemic is a case where we say, look, these doctors, these pharmaceutical companies were corrupt. We don't say, look, every individual is seeking their own, to maximize their own happiness as per classical economic theory, and therefore everybody who went out and bought OxyContin by the armload was, a free, rational economic agent seeking their own happiness, and who's going to interfere with that? No, we say this is an addictive substance that sort of hijacks the human brain in ways that makes people act radically contrary to their self-interest, and anybody who is making money off of that process is exploiting. This is not a properly free market.
Right.
And so we now know, the science now says, look, this is the case with a lot of digital products, that they are hijacked. And I mean, like one of the things Jonathan Haidt talks about in his book, like, testimony from Facebook executives in closed door meetings that's been released by whistleblowers, that they basically say, we know that we are hijacking the brain and doing this addictive thing. So how is that different from what the Sacklers did with opioids? We recognize that even with adults, the truly free market requires protection against exploitation of using addictive substances. And so I think that's where I think we need to be thinking about, how do we regulate the design of these devices in such a way that, basically penalizes product design that is designed to be addictive and rewards product design that is designed to actually aid human productivity and ingenuity.
Well, excellent. On that note, we're going to end the conversation there. I'm sure we could talk for much longer, but that's, I think, a very comprehensive picture of what this great article is. I think, therefore, I am. It's up at the American Compass. We will put it in the show notes. But Brad, where else should listeners who are more interested in seeing and reading and listening to your work, where should they look?
Yeah, so I have a Substack that I write at regularly, and I put links to all the new material I do there. So that's just bradlittlejohn.substack.com. So check me out there.
Awesome. Thanks again, Brad.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.